Okay, can you see that? Good. Okay, so well, anyway, good morning again. And this is a presentation from the Center for Future Consciousness. And we are up to Module 7, the evolution in the late 19th century, Utopias, robots, the mystical, and the Martians. And this is part of a series of webinars on the evolution or the history of science fiction. Up on that original screen there, and we will come back to these people and these books, are some significant writers and figures of the last 3 decades of the 19th century, and some very important works in science fiction, such as Looking Backward and A Journey in Other Worlds and Erewhon and Edison's Conquest of Mars, which we'll eventually get to. As I mentioned, this is part of a series, The Evolution of Science Fiction, and the module today is drawn from Volume 1, Chapters 8, 9, and 10, Prometheus to the Martians. There's 5 volumes in the series, and in fact, in the next webinar, we're going to be moving into Volume 2. This is the ending chapters in Volume 1. And what I do usually at the beginning, just do a quick review. Last time I talked about the Sandman and a female robot that the central character falls in love with, and the Mummy, which was a first significant view of future human society in depth and detail, the rise of the study of electricity and mesmerism and the Industrial Revolution and Edgar Allan Poe and the diamond lens and the brick moon. And then the bulk of the last module spent on Jules Verne and a number of his most well-known novels, Journey to the Center of the Earth, From the Earth to the Moon, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Off on a Comet, and finally Paris in the 20th Century, which was not published till well over 100 years after he died, and was his most futurist science fiction novel and probably his most depressing vision of the future. So that was last time. Now, today, and I'm just putting this up here, and I know it's a little overpowering to look at all of these terms and all of these books, but today, this is an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. The theory of evolution and the concept of entropy and future war novels and Erewhon and the evolution of machines and Vril, the power of the coming race, and Flammarion, a French astronomer who was cosmic and mystical and had a big influence on people after him, talk about a set of future utopian societies and dystopian visions in the late 19th century. And then steam men and robots and the mythos of Western conquest and Edison age. And Edison appearing as a character in science fiction novels. The Future Eve as a novel about a robot that Edison creates. And then Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a very significant novel in psychological science fiction. And then a whole slew of novels that come out toward the end of the 19th century on journeying into the solar system, and particularly going to Mars, and then the Martians invading us in return. So main themes today: human evolution, war, dystopian, utopian societies, robots, Thomas Edison, and the Martians. Now, the place I'm beginning is I'm beginning with these 2 central archetypal mythic narratives of the future that emerged in science in the second half of the 19th century and appeared to be rather contradictory in their implications, and would have a great influence on the evolution of science fiction. In fact, I should note right off the bat that prior to the publications of Origin of Species and The Descent of Man, there was a scattering of science fiction being written, and the one in particular who wrote quite a bit was Jules Verne. But after The Descent of Man comes out in 1872, the amount of science fiction explodes, and evolution seems to be connected up with that. Once evolution comes on, becomes a popular idea within science, we start to see a lot more science fiction being written. I have a quote here, though, from a German idealist philosopher who lived a bit earlier, who definitely believed in the transformative theory of reality, Johann Fichte. There is nowhere anything lasting, neither outside me nor within me, only incessant change. I nowhere know of any being, not even my own. There is no being. And this is going to be a key theme in both the theory of evolution and the theory of entropy, that reality is transformative as opposed to, in some sense, stable. And both of these ideas come out of science, and both of them are going to impact the way we think about the future and the way science fiction writers think about the future. And I'm going to start with the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution actually goes back at least 2,000 years. In modern times, we start to see the beginnings of it forming in both science and theology. In 17th century, for example, in the Sacred History of the Earth, writers such as James Burnett were attempting to combine naturalistic ideas with the Bible, and that becomes the main theme running in through the whole next 2 centuries. People attempting to reconcile what they were finding out about evolution, the history of life, the history of the earth, and trying to make it consistent with the Bible, and in particular Genesis. But it seemed to end up being kind of a losing struggle. One thing after another kept unsettling the efforts to synthesize the two. For example, Robert Hooke on the left-hand side there was a great student of fossils, and fossils seem to indicate, fossils in particular regarding life, seem to indicate that creatures had once existed on the earth that didn't exist anymore. And that ran against the idea that all the species on the earth had been created at the same time. And none of them had disappeared, but there's all these fossils in the ground. They kept accumulating. And James Hutton in the middle there discovered the deep time of the earth. There's a quote here which is very famous from him, the father of geology: "We see no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end." Hutton brought home the idea that time extended back into the past much, much further than we ever imagined. And right on the heels of Hutton comes Herschel, the astronomer, who demonstrated even more strongly that the universe was much, much older than we thought it was, and that indeed the universe was not eternal and changeless, but rather underwent transformation. So Herschel, as an astronomer, is demonstrating a level of cosmic flux that hadn't been anticipated in biblical visions of time. Immanuel Kant thought evolution applied to the universe as a whole, but thought God had designed and directed it. Lamarck comes along a bit later and proposes that animals indeed, in fact, the whole kingdom of life has evolved. And even though Lamarck gets a bad name today, Lamarck, in fact, provided the first comprehensive scientific theory of evolution. His idea, though, was that evolution occurs through acquired characteristics, such as the giraffe stretching his neck every generation, which makes the giraffe's neck get longer and longer in its progeny. The idea of survival of the fittest doesn't even come in with Darwin. It comes in through Herbert Spencer, who attempted to develop, and you could see the vastness of his scholarship. That's his collected works down below, a comprehensive evolutionary vision of the entire universe. So there were lots of people talking about evolution through the 17th and 18th centuries. And so when Darwin comes along and formulates the theory of evolution, he was building on the work of many other people. And I have a quote here, which is actually the the final line in The Origin of Species, which is, there is a grandeur in this view of life. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. And Darwin believed that evolution implied progress, that evolution was a process that generated progress. And we're going to get into that because, in fact, there's different debates on that one. But Darwin saw nature as transformative, but he saw it as progressive. And in seeing it transformative, his view of nature clashed with the static creationism of traditional Western religion. So instead of thinking that the world is the same today, yesterday, and the day before, Darwin is presenting a scientific theory that says that reality changes. And in fact, not only did that conflict with religious static creationism, it actually ran at odds with Newton's clockwork universe. And Newton's clockwork universe was envisioned as a stable reality too. And so Darwin is questioning whether there's any really fundamental stability in nature and reality as a whole through his theory of evolution. And his explanation of the evolution of life does not bring in any purpose or design. That is, it's a lawful process involving variation of offspring and natural selection, but there's no design to it. Nothing is moving this in a certain direction. It moves, that is, evolution occurs due to fundamental features or forces within nature without purpose. But he believed that evolution entailed progress, and life went from the simple to the complex. And in The Descent of Man in 1871, he applied evolution to humans and to our social history. And evolution provided a new framework for scientific plausibility. Are the stories that I'm writing, the narratives I'm writing, consistent with an evolutionary vision of reality? Now, one of the things that comes up with Darwin, which is a big shift from the past, is that given the nature of evolution, the future is uncertain. Is humanity going to survive? Is humanity going to evolve? Well, that's up for grabs. Before, humans had a privileged position, whether it was through religion or even during the Enlightenment. We saw ourselves as the pinnacle of creation. But in Darwin, in the theory of evolution, evolution turns out to be a contingent, chancy, competitive, who knows what's going to happen in the future kind of affair. And so all of a sudden we have all this drama and uncertainty in the future. And evolution suggested numerous questions, scenarios, and narratives for science fiction regarding the evolution of human society, the evolution of life on other planets, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, I know I'm going through this rather quickly. If you want a more detailed exposition on this, buy my book, because I go into it in a lot more detail in there, how evolution changed our narratives about things. In particular, evolution gave us a new scientific cosmic narrative. And again, here's another quote from Darwin regarding his view on progress and how they connected with evolution. As natural selection works solely for and the good of each being, all corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress towards perfection. So Darwin definitely believed that evolution was creating progress. And he believed so based on a scientific theory. And a thing to point out in that regard is that even though the idea of progress developed during the Enlightenment a century and a half earlier, the theory of enlightenment and secular progress developed in the West was not a scientific theory. Rather, it was a normative theory regarding how we should go about creating progress using science, democracy, and reason. What Darwin presents here is a naturalistic theory of progress. That is, nature all on its own, without human purpose, without human science, without human intervention, is going to progress. And it does so because of natural selection and the continual process of things going from the simple to the complex. So we have a scientific theory now of progress in Darwin's hands. Now, people grabbed hold on to Darwin's ideas regarding evolution, and they attempted in different ways to apply them to humanity. Now, one thing that developed in the decade or two after Darwin came out with his ideas was the notion of social Darwinism, which basically was that since evolution was built on competition, those people today and societies today that are at the top of the heap economically and politically, they have got there because they are the best in terms of the law of competition. That is, competition is justified naturalistically as a way to live, and because certain people are at the top, that implies that somehow they are better. And another way to put it is that the social Darwinists believed that might makes right. That is, they thought that those that are most powerful are doing best because of the principles of competitive evolution. And a lot of people had a lot of trouble with that because it seemed to justify the fact that whoever has more power somehow is better than people who have less power economically or physically. Darwin, though, didn't just believe in competition. Darwin also believed in cooperation as a fundamental principle in evolution. And Huxley, Thomas Huxley, who's in the middle there, actually questioned social Darwinism, thinking that, you know, evolution is a brute fact. What we need to do is we need to guide evolution with ethics. Darwin thought ethics actually was an evolutionary phenomena. And down on the left-hand side there, you see a picture of a young man holding a skull with his arm over the skeleton of, I think it's a gorilla or it might be an orangutan. And that person there is H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells would think very deeply about the connection between morality and progress in the future and evolution. Wells believing that we needed to guide evolution with moral principles and evolution wasn't enough. On the other hand, Darwin's nephew, Francis Galton, thought that what evolution seemed to indicate was that we could take the bull by the horn, so to speak, and selectively breed humans, because we have been selectively breeding animals, producing artificial evolution through selective breeding of animals. Now, why don't we just do it with humans too? Galton had both a positive eugenics and a negative eugenics ideas. The positive one would be select for the best. The negative would be eliminate the worst, but depending on what do you mean by the best or the worst. Eugenics ran into a lot of flack over the next 50 years and ended up being associated with Hitler's fascism. But at the same time, the notion of the purposeful evolution of humanity using either genetics or technology of some form or different forms of other forms of science has been a very popular theme in science fiction. And it's been a popular theme in future studies too. The transhumanists, in a sense, believe in eugenics, a techno-enhanced eugenics. So eugenics comes in as an idea piggybacking on evolution and becomes a basic theme in a lot of science fiction to come. That is, we can purposefully guide our future evolution. So Wells's question and Huxley's question and a lot of people's question is going to be, how do we ethically guide the process since we have this new narrative of evolution involving purposeful evolution using science and technology, and how does ethics fit together with that? In fact, there's a quote up here from the image of the label for eugenics down on the right-hand side. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. So when evolution comes on the scene, what follows from it is a lot of discussion of how that's going to apply to the future of humanity, and do we guide evolution, and how do we do that? Now, on the other hand, almost in contradiction to that first theory, the theory of evolution, we have a second theory which emerges around the same time, and it's a collective effort of a lot of different people. The theory that basically is the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy of the universe tends toward a maximum by Rudolf Clausius. And the second law states that the entropy of an isolated system never decreases because isolated systems always evolve toward thermodynamic equilibrium, a state of maximum entropy. The second law of thermodynamics seems to indicate that everything over time moves from order toward increasing homogenization and chaos, which is the opposite of the idea of evolution, where things over time, at least locally, move toward increasing differentiation, intricacy, and order. So it looks like order and information is going uphill across time, according to the theory of evolution, where according to the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of entropy, things are going in the opposite direction. How could that possibly be? But notice we have two different visions here about the future. And the second one, the heat death of the universe, the whole universe is going to eventually break down. Now, I have a funny little quote that I took from Philip Dick, which sort of hits the nail on the head regarding the idea of entropy. He puts it into his kind of comical, inventive terms. He says, Kipple is useless objects. When nobody's around, Kipple reproduces itself. The entire universe is moving towards a final state of total, absolute Kippleization. And that's just sort of an inventive, comical way of saying the same thing, which is that little by little, everything is becoming increasingly useless and chaotic and all mishmashed up. And eventually the whole universe is going to end up that way. Now, there's an image of Clausius and an image of Helmholtz, who is the person responsible for coming up with the expression, the heat death of the universe. And then on the right side of him is Lord Kelvin, who put together the first theoretical scientific paper on how the second law would apply to the universe as a whole. Kelvin was hesitant about saying that eventually the entire universe is going to break down, but it appears on the surface, if the universe were a finite system, that eventually everything is going to fall apart, including humanity and all of human civilization. So we have these two different visions that emerge in the 1860s, 1870s on time, the past, and the future out of science. There I have an image of Shiva, the Hindu god of creation and destruction. And in fact, that's what we have here. We have two images, one of creation, one of destruction applying, or one image of the creation of order and the other, the creation of destruction. That is creation versus destruction. We have one view which seems to engender hope and a sense of advancement, and another view which seems to engender despair and a feeling of disintegration. One view seems to highlight becoming and birth and something new and perhaps better. The other view seems to highlight the theme of death and passing away, and everything eventually dies. On one hand, we have the cycle and static creationism from the past, and now we have the idea of the line of transformation and the dialectic of an oscillation of order and chaos and entropy and evolution, which will influence different people and different writers in the future. So in the late 19th century, the last 3 decades, we have two dominant cosmic views of nature coalescing in science. And once they're out there, science fiction seems to take off. And interestingly, there's a date that people identify. May 1st, 1871. Jess Nivens, who is a science fiction writer, a scholar, enthusiast, identifies that date as the day science fiction was invented. Now, he means modern science fiction, but indeed that day is very significant because on that day, 3 significant science fiction novels, 2 are published, and the 3rd was submitted for publication. Those 3 novels would have a big impact on the future evolution of science fiction. All of them coming into public consciousness on the same day. And the first one has to do with war. The Battle of Dorking, Warnings About Future War. Now, most people probably have never heard of this novel, but this novel created a great sensation in England and across Europe when it came out. Chesney was a retired British soldier, captain, who thought England was not prepared for a future war with Germany. And Germany scared the bejeebies out of him with their defeat of France very quickly in the Franco-Prussian War due to better strategy and better weapons. And although he would warn the government in nonfiction essays about England not being prepared, and that he was actually there talking about future consciousness, don't be complacent the way things are, think out ahead, the government wasn't paying attention to him. So he wrote a story about it. And the story, The Battle of Dorking, was very gritty, very realistic. Germany, although never really clearly identified in the novel, invades England and defeats the English army and takes over England. And that really unsettled the consciousness of the government in England, in Great Britain. And in fact, it caused, on one hand, a very focused acceleration of militarization in England to be better prepared for an eventual war, for example, with Germany, but it also provoked at least 400 future war novels that imitated it over the next 3 or 4 decades. So we have this idea of be prepared for disasters in the future. In particular, be prepared that other countries might invade us, think ahead, and in this case here, I can effectively engage your emotions in thinking through writing a very gritty and anxiety-producing story about it, as opposed to writing a set of essays over the whole thing. And this was, in fact, an extremely influential book that came out, published in 1871. And in fact, 2 quotes that bring this up. Chesney's Battle of Dorking must be the most talked about and imitated short story in the history of publishing up to that point in time. And a second one, which is right on the cover here, no book has ever touched the public conscience more strongly than this. So this book got science fiction writers and just writers about the future into the issue of future wars, preparing for the future, not being complacent about where we are today, that other countries may be militarizing, and therefore we get into this kind of arms race. And as an argument that has been made by different people, this whole slew of futurist novels about war may have actually primed the pump, not just predicting World War I, but feeding it, and to some degree causing it. That is, it caused this hyper anxiety and militarization, increasing competition in the mentality in Europe, which may have been a significant cause in the actual eruption of World War I. So they predicted it and they caused it to some degree at the same time. Now, if worrying about other countries wasn't enough, at the same time, Samuel Butler wrote a book, Erewhon, or Over the Range. And by the way, Erewhon, if you look at it, is almost nowhere spelled backwards. And Erewhon is a incredibly interesting, engaging, and well-written novel about a man who journeys over a mountain range somewhere either in New Zealand or Australia, and comes upon a human civilization very, very different than ours. And around the 1860s, 1870s, in the United States and other parts of the world, there was a romantic movement that developed that found its expression in Walden by Henry David Thoreau and through Ralph Waldo Emerson, transcendentalism, which called for a retreat back to nature or turning back to nature, and that the industrialized world had become too materialistic, too commercialized, too crazy, too frenzied, and we had to go back to a better sense of self-sufficiency and rely more on intuition and less on reason and experimentation and the craziness of the modern world. And Erewhon falls into that tradition because what we see in this imagined society is a group of people who have decided to eliminate almost all machines in their reality. And they have decided to do that because in their history, a scientist has written a book, and the name of the book is The Book of the Machines. And that scientist had applied the Darwinian theory of evolution to machines, arguing that machines, in fact, have been evolving, and that we are purposively involved in the evolution of those machines, period. And that indeed, in the long run, machines are going to outpace us and take over the world. And they are going to do so because we are increasingly becoming servants of them, and we are maximizing along many different dimensions the complexity, intelligence, and pervasiveness of machines. And so what Samuel Butler does is he takes the principle of evolution, the theory of evolution, and he says the same thing is going to apply to the transformation of machines. And so in this society, which is kind of upside down in many ways, what the people have done is decided to get rid of machines. They have a lot of other interesting quirks too. For example, people who get sick are punished for getting sick, physically sick, because they're blamed for it. They should have been taking better care of their health. On the other hand, people who commit crimes, moral crimes, are given therapy and given various ways in which to treat them and not blamed for their crimes at all. So in this world, physical illness is your fault, whereas criminal behavior, you're the victim. You're seen as the victim. And in fact, in this society, if you are robbed or murdered or raped, you are seen as the one responsible for it by allowing the other person to do it to you. So it's a really crazy and interesting vision of an alternative society. And the key thing in here, the key thing in terms of our understanding of humanity and machines, is how deeply and insightfully Butler sees that we are facilitating and becoming increasingly involved in the maintenance, development, and care of those things that we thought were serving us, but indeed we are serving them. And Erewhon became an extremely popular novel back at that time, in the 1870s. Now, the third novel that came out at that time was the most popular one of all, Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, by Bulwer Lytton. And one fascinating thing in Vril, The Power of the Coming Race is that Bulwer Lytton, anticipates and clarifies very well the idea of cyborgs. The story of Vril, The Power of the Coming Race is of a man who goes under the ground. That scenario we've seen before in science fiction. And he ends up going below sufficiently where he comes upon these open caverns down deep in the earth and encounters this civilization of advanced humans who have branched off from the surface humans thousands of years earlier, somewhere around the time of Noah's flood, actually. And these Vrilia, and that's what they call themselves, Vrilis-ya, they have a civilization which is empowered by this limitless source of energy, which they call Vril, which sounds sort of like electricity. But indeed, what they've been able to create is a society of humans who are biologically bigger, more intelligent, and ethically more advanced than surface humans, and a set of technologies that are way beyond our own, including among them a wand that each new Vrilia at birth is given, that is a technological device that in that individual's maturation, that individual learns how to develop a symbiosis and resonance with that machine. The machine and the human become like one. It's an instrument that empowers the Vrilia to read thoughts, to fly, to move objects or destroy objects by simply willing it. And it's part of their education. So their education is this development of a resonance and interconnection between their biological and a technological all-purpose tool that becomes customized to their own psyche. And this novel had a tremendous impact on popular culture. Lots of people started to form clubs and organizations based on the philosophy in it. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And it's a very fascinating look at an ideal society that's made up out of these enlightened and superior cyborgs. And there's a warning in it because they're running out of room down there and they're thinking that maybe they're going to come up to the surface and invade us because they need more space. It's an exhaustive and detailed study of the society too. The thing that I found most interesting about it was this educational philosophy and procedure they had for developing themselves as cyborgs and how it empowered them. So instead of the machine being an adversary, and here the machine becomes an instrument of empowerment in Vril. Now let's move forward a little more and hit some more robots and some more utopias and get on some other cosmic journeys. By the way, here are some illustrations done back in the latter part of the 19th century. And a lot of these are by Albert Rabida, who I will come to in a moment, who was the first great science fiction artist, but also a great writer of future humanity. And science fiction art definitely evolved significantly during that time. Now, I wanted to begin, though, with Camille Flammarion. And Camille Flammarion was an interesting character, French, a child prodigy who published his first two books when he was 16 years old, one on the history of the universe, turned into a popular astronomer, had a tremendous influence on raising European consciousness on the wonders of astronomy, was really into speculating and writing on alien life, applying the theory of evolution to alien life. He built an observatory in his house with a giant telescope. And in another room in his house, he conducted seances where he attempted to talk to the dead. And in fact, he combined his astronomy and his cosmic speculations with mystical and spiritual speculations. The quote I have up there from him as a starting point is a quote from his book, Omega. Time lapses into eternity, but eternity remains and time is born again. And these universes passed away in their turn, but infinite space remained. People with worlds and stars and souls and suns, and time went on forever, for there could be neither end nor beginning. Flammarion believed in an eternal cyclic metaverse, that after our universe, there would be another one, and another one, and another one. He assimilated the idea of evolution, the ideas of evolution and entropy, thinking this universe would come to an end due to entropy, but another universe would come in to take its place, and new living forms and new forms of intelligence would arise. He also believed that when we die, our spirits or souls ascend from this world to other planets. And through our ongoing spiritual history, we continually evolve through a series of spiritual levels, which involve moving out into higher and higher spheres of the architecture of the universe. So there is no death. Rather, there is a kind of repeated reincarnation that takes place through hopping about the cosmos. And he not only wrote books on astronomy, but he wrote books in which he attempted to explain this theory. Now, this theory had been around before, and we're going to see it come up again, but it's a vision of human evolution which takes the universe as the terrain in which humans will evolve. We're not just going to evolve on the earth, we're going to be evolving cosmically as we move up the ladder cosmically. And people before wrote about it, and people write about it afterwards. We should note, though, that even though it has in one hand a scientific flavor to it, it's just a variation on when you die, you're going to go to heaven theory. Except here, there is no absolute heaven. There's just jumping up and up and up through stages. Now, if that sounds a little bit flaky and crazy, on the other hand, Flammarion was an incredible scholar and scientist. In Omega, the book on the right side, he has a very detailed review of all the different theories that have been proposed as to how the world will end. Great scholarship. In another book, he had a historical review of all the different theories of aliens that had been produced up to that point, from Huygens and Kepler and the people that I talked about before, like Fontenelle. He did great historical scholarship. In Omega, there is more mathematics in that book dealing with catastrophes than any other science fiction book up to that point in time. And in Lumen, the book on the left, which involves a person from the earth making mental contact with the soul of a dead human who takes the live human on a trip through the cosmos, he explains using the principle of the finite speed of light why a permanent record of everything that has happened in the universe still exists in the universe. Because light has a finite speed, when it reflects off of objects, it carries out into space a record of what is happening at that point where that light had been reflected. So as you move out into space, you can watch in reverse the entire history of the Earth played back, or any other planet for that matter. Those diagrams in the middle are diagrams out of the book Omega, and they're very kind of spooky, graphic, spiritual, etc. And a very, very interesting set of pictures that Flammarion had people put together. The way I describe Flammarion, and he would influence people after him that I'm even going to talk about in a bit, he presented a scientifically informed, lots of science in him, mystically inspired, he believed in spirits, evolutionary mythology. And he's fascinating to read because he writes stuff almost in a poetic fashion, and then he intersperses it with lots of science, et cetera, along the way. Now, I'm not sure about what time we're at right now. What time are we at right now?
We are at 12:53 my time.
Okay, Why don't we take a break before we do William Morris? Because, yeah, that's a good stopping point right at the middle there. Let me, let's see, I gotta skip. And I'm gonna start. Somebody who's after our own heart, so to speak. The huge mass of men are compelled by folly and greed to make harmful and useless things. And this is from William Morris and his extremely popular, influential utopian vision written in 1890 called News from Nowhere. And Morris was very concerned about the industrialized West. And he envisions a world 100 years from now where the extreme top-down, competitive, capitalist, frenzied world of today, his day, is overturned. And people have gone back to a much simpler, almost medieval kind of existence. And work is no longer drudgery, like in the factories. Work is connected with pleasure and personal accomplishment and art. People create beauty as integral to their lives. And it's one of those stories where somebody falls asleep and wakes up 100 years later and the world is different. And Morris saw extremely negative trends occurring in the modernized West. And News from Nowhere is an alternative vision to that kind of reality. He was an individualist, but he was also a socialist. He didn't have government. There's no schooling. There's no prisons. There's no marriage contracts. Nobody has any possessions in his utopian world. And there's literally no top-down organization. He thinks that people in his ideal world simply work and do things for the benefit of everybody. And there's a lot less machinery. In fact, he saw us as being enslaved by industry. Enslaved in the sense that in his time, more and more people went to work in factories involved in the construction of more and more machines. And in fact, here this quote, compelled by folly and greed to make harmful and useless things. All right, in his ideal world, even though 1890, we're starting to see the beginnings of it, there's no motorized transportation. People move around with horses and boats, sailboats. So one thing I will say about Morris in this very idyllic and back to nature kind of reality is that it's boring. And so even though it seems peaceful and it seems to eradicate a lot of the possible negative trends around us and the negative trends of industrialization, competition, capitalism, commercialism, etc., I don't know whether I could live in such a reality because people sort of just sit around and fiddle, and nothing ever seems to happen. And in fact, basically that's what it turns into. The world is peaceful in Morris's News from Nowhere, but nothing happens. It's not transformative. It may not be that people are crazy, insane, and criminal, but nothing happens. And one day is the same as next. So they become very present focused in their reality. That was one very influential utopia of the 1890s. More influential, in fact, Morris wrote his book as a response to this guy. Edward Bellamy wrote Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, came out in 1888, and argued for a non-capitalist, socialist, top-down, industrialized, technologized organization with no buying and selling and companies of any kind. He thought the culprit in our world, the thing that was negative, was capitalism. And this book sold millions of copies when it came out. And we have a couple quotes up there. Buying and selling is essentially antisocial in all its tendencies. It is an education in self-seeking, selfishness, at the expense of others. And no society whose citizens are trained in such a school can possibly rise above a very low grade of civilization. And Bellamy's scenario is very similar to Morris's. We have a man who falls asleep and wakes up 100 years later into this transformed world. And the thing that's very impressive about Bellamy's book, which is very well known in the history of science fiction, is how tenaciously, persistently optimistic Bellamy is about the possibility of this utopia being practically realized. When I was reading it, I got the feeling that I was a creature of 21st century skepticism of it can't possibly work. This can't possibly work. And Bellamy, through that book, continually presents arguments as to why his vision is realistic, possible, and it will work. And it was very, very influential at the time. And I would recommend, if you want to read a book that takes a uncompromising, extremely rational and articulate defense of the real possibility of the human improvement of society, it would read Looking Backward. And it's an odd title because he moves forward in time, but then he goes back and looks at 1887 in the novel. He's transported back there and he finds our present world extremely repugnant and aversive. That is, he gets a taste of how good things could be. And then when he looks at us now, he sees how crazy and awful his world was. And it's a very comprehensive utopia. It's not anti-technological. There's lots of technological advances, but there's social advances and there's political advances, there's economic advances. He lays out a very detailed exposition of an ideal future world. Now here we have the same problem though again. By the time you get through reading it, you're very impressed by his intellect, you're very impressed by his philosophical sophistication, but you think to yourself, this world would be boring too, because everything is very orderly. With Morris, it's all bottom up. Everybody is an individual with total freedom and they just by nature work together, but nothing ever really happens. In Bellamy's world, where he thinks progress will come as a consequence of this, it's very top down and nobody has any possessions. We have an industrial army literally, and everybody gets a guaranteed income, but it doesn't look like anything's going to happen there either. Now, the world envisioned of the future at this time that I think is unequivocally the best novel is Albert Robita's The 20th Century. And Robita was another Frenchman. In fact, the French in the latter part of the 19th century had a slew of very, very good and well-informed and philosophical science fiction writers. We'll have some more to come. And Robita wrote a whole series of books, both on space travel and on the future. And sad to say, his best, most famous work was only recently translated into English, The 20th Century. And here's a quote from him. Overwrought, wired up, frightfully busy and nervous, life in the electrical age, we must admit, has overtaxed the human race and brought about a kind of universal degeneration. And the 20th century is a very real, rich slice of life of Paris in 1952. The book was written in 1882. And it is a multi-dimensional picture of the future. So there's lots of advanced technologies, including all different kinds of air transportation. The people in the mid-20th century have moved the moon closer to the earth, so it would create a bigger glow for lovers on romantic nights. They have raised the continent in Asia. They have floating casinos and submarines and mobile taxis, aerial taxis. They have electrical wiring of everything interconnected together, including something down there in the right-hand corner that clearly is like an iPhone, where you can talk with your friends on this device and see their pictures. So it's technologically super advanced, and it's crazy. It's a crazy vision with these madcap characters involved in all kinds of antics. Oh, the women have become emancipated too, and now control politics. And the men have given up politics, but the men control business. Oh, and in case one of the things regarding business is the leading rich man figure in this novel has, with his business partners, bought Italy and turned it into a theme park. Food is pumped through tubes, and women have to find careers. And the story involves this lady who gets out of college and can't figure out what career she wants to participate in. And now lots of new careers are open to her, like becoming a lawyer, becoming a journalist, becoming a scholar. While the whole story is going on, and this is not a didactic novel, this is literally a slice of life. It's the events and antics of people day to day in this world. Rabida keeps bringing up all of the incredible advances, and then tongue-in-cheek he will say, and you know, on the other hand, this has really caused lots of problems too. And he goes back and forth with that. This seems good, but is it so good? The French government, every 30 years, have staged revolutions so people can get their revolutionary impulses and their complaints out of their system, and then it goes back to the way things were again. It's very realistic, filled with nutsiness, written very, very well. And to top it all off, Rabida was a great artist. And so he illustrated all of his books. And there you could see a bunch of his illustrations. And they're like Victorian 19th century versions of a 20th century. But his books, like in the 20th century, that novel is filled with maybe a couple hundred illustrations, you know, floating mobile houses and submarines, and you can see the electrical wiring in one other one where the lady is leaning over there talking to somebody. So it's, oh, and one last thing I should mention about Rabida is he saw that news was going to turn into theatrics. It was going to turn into entertainment. And people in Paris had these big video screens that they would gather around and watch the news. And the news corporations actually, in various ways, attempted to orchestrate world affairs so that there'd be something eventful and entertaining to watch every day on the news. So the distinction between fiction or entertainment and fact gets blurred. And this is something clearly that has happened with us in the 21st century, where news has indeed become entertainment. So he was better at predicting things in the future than anybody else before him. In fact, Jules Verne took a lot of stuff from Rabida. The 20th century, I think, is one of the 3 or 4 best science fiction novels of the 19th century. Jeannie started reading it. She didn't particularly think that much of it. She can make a comment on it, but I think it is a very engaging and interesting novel to read in terms of its prescience and in terms of its comedic element. So as a final little story on on the dystopias and utopias. In that same decade, John Ames Mitchell, who founded Life magazine, wrote a novel called The Last American. And The Last American takes place in the 30th century. And it's about a group of Persian sailors who crossed the Atlantic in search of the mythical, historical land of America that presumably existed in the distant past. And they come into New York City, which they call New York, and they find it totally deserted and in decay. And they come to the conclusion, based on what little they knew about history, plus what they see there, that Americans were great with physical or mechanical ingenuity, but were a mongrel race that borrowed from everybody else, and that all they cared about was greed and money and luxury, and they collapsed because they just simply ended up being too greedy and wanting to control the world. And there doesn't seem to be anybody left. And then they journey down to Washington, D.C., and they run into three people who are living in the Library of Congress, I think. I'm not sure, one of those famous government buildings. And they get into a fight with them, and they end up having to kill them all. And they take back with them on their boat the skull of the last American. And that's the end of it. And it's an interesting comical critique of what could come of Western civilization and the rising up again of Persian civilization, and how we might look to people with our capitalist and money-oriented society with great mechanical ingenuity, but having no development or evolution in our character and our ethics. And so it's a good critique. So we got this whole bunch of things toward the end of the 19th century of utopias that are boring, dystopias that are crazy and interesting, and this final commentary by Mitchell on the direction we're heading in is not a very good direction at all. Now, while that serious science fiction was going on, American science fiction took off in the 1870s, just about the same time as the stuff in Europe did. But over here in the United States, it kind of took the form of Westerns, beginning with The Steam Man of the Prairies in about 1868. In the United States, a very popular kind of publication back then was the dime novel. And the dime novels would have different adventure stories. And early on, a whole slew and wave of dime novels began to appear, get published, and became very popular, involving different mechanical inventions, beginning with a steam man that was actually based on an actual working steam man, the Newark steam man, which you can see up there, about a mechanical man who pulled a wagon or a cart. But after that, in these dime novels that came out, we found all kinds of inventive mechanical gadgets, from flying boats and submarines and mechanical water spiders and mechanical horses and mechanical everything under the sun, where the characters would journey around the world, beginning in the West, and meet indigenous people, fight with them, conquer the areas, and have these great adventures. And in fact, these mythical, fictional characters included a very famous set of people: Frank Reed Jr., Jack Wright, and Thomas Edison Jr. And they became recurrent figures in these novels. And In these novels, they play the same scenario over and over again. The white man is civilized. We're out to conquer the uncivilized world. We're going to turn them into something more civilized. They're going to fight with us. They're going to have to kill and defeat them. And they're kind of Wild West novels, or they're novels that are similar to the Americans, not the Americans, excuse me, the Europeans on the East Coast moved west and conquered all of the uncivilized people, the Americans, who lived out west. And they follow the same scenario over and over again. John Clute, who is one of the two authors of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, which I've recommended to you before, said that this whole slew of novels, which was morally reprehensible, as bad as the dime novels that came out to attempt to justify the Confederates' slavery, had a similar plot that he called Edisonade. And Edisonade, the way he defined it, it was modeled on Thomas Edison, who by then was becoming a very famous inventor in the United States. And Edisonades could be described as any story that features a young US male inventor, hero, who uses his ingenuity to extricate himself from tight spots, and who by doing so saves himself from foreign oppressors, or a brave young inventor creates a tool or a weapon or both that enables him to save the girl and his nation, usually America, and the world from some menace, whether it be foreigners or evil scientists or aliens, and gets the girl and gets rich. And this is an American narrative archetype almost, that's going to play out in fundamentally the same form in American space opera. We just move from mechanical horses and mechanical men traveling across the plains of the United States or down into Australia or wherever else, and meeting the indigenous people, or meeting warlike aliens and having to beat them. And it's the scientist inventor as a young heroic person who both possesses the scientific understanding but is also courageous and the good guy who will beat them at the end. Louis Senerins was referred to as the American Jules Verne because he wrote a lot of these. In fact, he presumably wrote something like 400 or 500 of them. In fact, there were more of these written, more of these dime novels than all the science fiction magazines that were published by Hugo Gernsback. Now, as an interesting twist, and keep in mind, this is very American in its mentality, as an interesting twist on how fiction and fact get mixed together. A few years ago, and you could see the image down there at the bottom, Frank Reed, in fact, here is the book right in front of you. A couple writers created this book about Frank Reed. And in this book, they present Frank Reed and Frank Reed Jr. as if they were real people who lived in the 19th century, who went on all of these various adventures that were chronicled in all of these individual historical magazines, or fictional magazines. And it's a very fascinating look at something that involves taking something from fiction and turning it into something that presumably happened in history. And also, as another twist on this whole thing, Thomas Edison, who is a real character, who presented a very favorable self-promoting image of himself, according to John Clute, becomes a character in science fiction magazines. So fact becomes fiction and fiction becomes fact. So again, we get this blurring together of things. What time do we have right now? Terry?
Yep, hang on a second. Let me look.
I'm sorry.
1:35.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I'm not going to get through everything that I had on my list here. Let me just I'm going to do one more No, I'm going to do two more interesting novels, and then we'll stop. We'll wait for the Martians for next time, okay? We'll do that next time. But let me just go two more, because these next two novels that come out are also very interesting, and we'll sort of finish things out here. As you remember, robots, when they came on the scene, often were females. In fact, in Sandman, the robot was a female. And in The Future Eve, and pardon my bastardization of French pronunciation, Villiers de l'Adam published a book in which the central character was Thomas Edison. And Thomas Edison has a friend who comes to him, and his friend tells him that he has fallen madly, obsessionally in love with this beautiful woman who is shallow and superfluous, and he finds it awful that he can't break free in his mind of this totally two-dimensional, beautiful female, and he's going to kill himself. And Thomas Edison, who is portrayed in the novel as this wise, scientific wizard-like individual, tells him that he can help him, and he'll help him by creating an exact duplicate of this woman, but that will have a greater profundity of soul. That is, she won't be shallow like this beautiful woman. And he creates this woman, this robot. The description of the creation of the robot in this novel exceeds any description that anybody had put together before regarding detail, intricacy, and both scientific and philosophical sophistication. This is a very convincing description of Edison making a robot. And Delia Adam gets into the philosophical issue of whether the robot, this female robot, possesses consciousness or not. And the robot comes to conscious life, and as far as I know, the first example of a Turing test in literature is done in this novel. That is, whether or not the female robot can fool the human starstruck lover into thinking that she is actually a conscious human and actually not a robot. And she passes the test. And so it looks as if science is able to create a conscious robot that actually has more depth and less artificiality to it than some humans do. But at the end of the story, we get a little fudge on the whole thing, because Thomas Edison reveals that he has a mystical woman assistant who is able to project her personality into the robot. So science couldn't do it, but mysticism did do it. But this is a very fascinating look at a late 19th century vision of future human evolution, robotic evolution, and actually the robot, in a way, turning out to be better than the human who the robot was intended to simulate. And it's a good discussion about consciousness, mind, and machines, too. And then finally, and we'll end on one last psychological science fiction novel of the time, which is probably one of the most famous novels of the period written, Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, you may ask why I put this into a history of science fiction, and that's because this is science fiction. This is clearly science fiction, this novel. Because in this novel, we have a scientist who's pondering the issue of human evolution and the nature of the human mind based upon contemporary psychological research into abnormal psychology at the time, creates a chemical that he ingests that transforms his mind into something different from what it normally is. In fact, what he intends to do is to free the dark side within him so that the dark side can have its opportunity to breathe so that it doesn't overpower the other side. In the end, the whole thing backfires, of course. And I don't know whether you know how this novel ends, but in the end, Dr. Jekyll has to commit suicide because Hyde is taking control of things. But this novel is very autobiographical in that Stevenson, the author, was raised by extremely fundamentalist religious parents who were very strict, whereas Stevenson had a tendency toward, as he put it, precocious depravities. And so he grew up a very guilty youth who wanted to engage in the kinds of things that Hyde engages in within this novel. And Stevenson had read at the time early abnormal and psychiatric literature on the notion that perhaps there were dual sides or multiple sides to the human mind. The human mind was not a unified whole. And this idea, of course, goes all the way back to religious thinking in the time of Christianity and Zoroastrianism. And Stevenson was quite well aware of the research, the notion of multiple personalities in a human mind that was occurring at the time. And Stevenson thought he had one. And so after he had this dream one night, he wrote the first draft of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in a frenzy, showed it to his wife. She didn't like it. He threw it away, burned it, and started the whole thing over again. But it's a very good psychological study of somebody attempting through the use of chemistry, but informed by contemporary psychology, to modify their psyche to, in a sense, evolve it, and how it eventually backfires. So if you had the opportunity to let your id run wild, and then you could cage it back up again, maybe that would be great. The problem is the id keeps getting stronger than Jekyll, or Hyde keeps getting stronger. And at the end, Jekyll doesn't even have to ingest the chemical for Mr. Hyde to come out. And this turned into a very popular novel, extremely popular, made it into plays, made it into movies up through the 20th century. And of course, Hollywood perverts the story by throwing in a romantic interest into the story. There is no romantic interest in the original Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but in the three film versions there are. Now, I was going to go into outer space, but I don't think I will because I don't really have time. But this is a good spot to end, because this is another variation on the psychological evolution theme. What could we do through chemistry? What is the human mind like? How could we modify it? How could we have an effect on it? And in fact, in this case here, Robert Louis Stevenson is somebody who was psychologically informed, as well as being somebody who he believed was suffering from a psychological problem that he envisioned ways in which to get around or alleviate, in this case, using a chemical. And of course, that's something we do all the time today. And when we have psychological problems, is that we use various chemicals to try to help ourselves out. But great novel. Of course, it's a great novel. If you've never read it, I would definitely recommend reading it, because it's so gothic and eerie and sinister and mysterious. And Stevenson was such a fantastic writer of the time, and it has a very compelling evil character in here, Mr. Hyde, very compelling. Yeah, so on that, I think we will escape for today. Gotten about 3/4 of the way through, not quite all the way.